Hey, welcome back everyone. I'm very excited to show you this video today. It's going to be cool, it's going to be fun, and I hope that you get some value learning how to properly plan your project as a developer. Now, we all have ideas and wonderful things that we want to build in code, and sometimes we get it right just to jump into the code directly. This series, where I showed the demo last week of me creating an intuitive way to create NFT cards for sales in a physical world, I'm going to take that demo, or I'm going to instead show you the journey of how I got to build that tool. And hopefully this will be valuable to you to see how you can properly plan your future projects as a developer. You can do this in many different ways. I'm going to show you one way that I take as an approach. It might be a tiny bit off to industry standards, and that's fine. Each person can manage their project in their own way, but this is the one I want to show you. This is very beneficial, not only for if you want to get a new developer to help you out and give them more context of the project and have them look at the diagrams, but also for yourself to keep track of what you are doing, where you are at, and the completion of your MVP or the tool or the piece of product or code that you are working on. Okay, so let's jump right into it. And just to recap, the tool that I've built was this tool where you could run a program, scan NFTs from a wallet, and then this tool needs to basically go and create all these wallets for a physical sales experience, selling your NFT and having a collector open it up. Here you can see I've got a few shots of the new design in the binders, but we'll get to that. We're going to build everything. We're going to show the plans, and then we're actually going to code it in later videos as well. So stick around and see the whole process. So in order to start tracking your project and planning your project, you need some software to help you track it, to write things down mostly, and also track things like tasks. Maybe it could have a type of board. So there's many software like this out there. There's Trello, there's Jira, all sorts of wonderful tools for you to use. The one I am using here today is called Notion. I am not so familiar with Notion, but I find that it had the necessary pages and things to add for me to plan a project successfully. So I'm just sticking to Notion. The tool you use doesn't matter. Like I said, it's more about the concept. So let's start by looking at how do we plan projects, or how can we better plan for a new idea that we actually want to bring into existence. So I thought I'll list out what we can do when we start thinking about planning for a new product, right? And step one is to really define the epic and the product vision. What does this mean, right? An epic is basically a goal, something that you would like to execute with this product, right? Similar to your product vision. So we can ask ourselves, in order for us to successfully generate some sort of paragraph that defines this, we can look at things like, what are we solving? Who is this for? And what the outcome, right? If you can answer these three questions, right, with your planned epic and product vision, you've successfully executed step one. So as we go through this list, I would like to go and show what I've implemented for this exact step, so we can go through it in a chronological order. In my development tab, I've set up a page for my project. Now, I recommend each and every project or piece of code that you write that has a purpose needs to have this main page. This is a page for if someone needs to ask you, what is your project about? What is this tool about? You can give them this one simple page, which will explain the epic and the product vision, basically. So I've got this one page. This is the entry point to all the other documentation that we have. And I start off with a nice title, NFT Card Generator for physical sales. I've got a short paragraph on what's this project about and some sort of a vision, right? And then I've got project epics. I only have one, but you can have many epics. And then some business values, just to keep me aligned on what am I kind of solving here. And generally, you will create business values because you might be doing this for some client, or you might be doing it for your own business. But if it's a personal project, it still helps defining those values. So let's look at the project and the description. The takeaway here is for you to fully understand what this project is about and is going to be about in the future. So for the project is I said to provide an internal tool that simplifies the process of preparing physical NFT cards for in-person sales, allowing galleries and team members to securely hand over ownership of NFTs in a tangible, collector-friendly way. And with this paragraph, it kind of encapsulates what I want to do here. I want to make it able for me to sell something in a tangible way and not worry about handing over ownership at a later stage. I want to do it right then, right there as I make the sale. And with that context, we can now get down to the epic. The epic kind of describes what we're going to build, right? What we need to produce at the end. And so for my Epic, I say, as an internal tool owner, I want to build a simple tool that helps our team scan a digital wallet for NFTs, preparing ownership details for each one, and generate high quality print ready physical cards. Each card will contain everything a collector needs to own and access their NFT. So this kind of describes what we want to build. It doesn't describe how we're going to build it. It just says we need a tool that can solve for this. Now, this is where the customization comes in. It all depends when you plan a project in what kind of context you find yourself in. If you are just a developer at a corporate company, you would most probably never see or have involvement in laying out the epics, as this is usually done by the business itself or the product owner. So the business or the product owner would say, this is what we want, right? And this goes for every step of my plan here. Usually, the product owner or business would define the epic and product vision. You would get down to the personas and user stories, which we'll get to. This will be owned by the business analyst. And then you would go into the architecture for an architect and then only development. But when we are a one single developer needing to plan our own projects, we can assume those roles ourselves and do it in our own way. Thus, you can see these epics that I write and stories, if we get down to it, is a lot more technically inclined than just non technical. So the epic is not that technical, but you'll see with the stories. Anyway, I just wanted to point out it will differ definitely in what context you have to plan for. Now, looking at some business values, something that's going to be of value for us having such a tool is that it ensures secure NFT sales in galleries, right? In physical sales. It bridges the digital and physical gap for collectors, simplifies onboarding for non technical buyers, and then enhance the professional experience of NFT acquisition. So this is all the benefits we'll get when we have built and actually used this tool. Okay. Now here's just sublinks to all the other documentation that I have that we'll go through. But in this step, where you define your epic and kind of project vision or product vision, is it should be this one page pager that you can give to someone and say, this is what I'm building. This is what it's all about. And they should understand. And again, this is up to you. I know there are many different Scrum Masters out there that might be breathing down my neck in the comments right now saying, well, you missed X, Y, and Z. I know, I know. This is the way I do it, but there are certain industry standard ways to add sections here as well and to move things around. But the goal stays the same. What are we building? Okay. So let's start by looking at once you've defined your epic and product vision, what's next? The next step would be to go ahead and define your user personas. Who is going to use your product? Now, in my case, I did not need to do that as I know who's going to use the product. It's going to be me. This is an internal tool. However, if you are building a tool that customers are going to physically use like a piece of software, it's very important to understand who will use it. What do they want to achieve? And break down epics into stories, right? And this is where user stories come in. What are user stories? So here we can take a look at our epic, what we want to achieve as a whole, and then break it into smaller pieces for the user. In this case, I am the user, the internal business owner would be running this tool. So what do I want to achieve? Breaking this epic down into manageable chunks for me to observe and interact with, or actually get to generating these cards. And the story should be broken down in a sense where it's from the user's perspective. right? So what do I expect at a current stage of the process? Or in the case of a user using an app, what are they expecting to do? For example, if it's a registration page, then you can say that as a user, I expect to register myself with X, Y, and Z details and have an account on the store or something like that. So let's go have a look at the stories that I've created. How I've broken down that epic that said basically we need to run an internal tool and it needs to basically create the physical cards. Now you'll see I've used this database in Notion. You can create your stories anywhere you like, as long as you can define a nice title and a description to the story. It's very important to add things like acceptance criteria and more description about the story. I've also created some tags to show that this story is a part of Epic 1 for if I have another Epic. And then I've given the story each its own tag so that I can also, if I create tasks for each of these stories later on, identify how they are connected. Maybe there's a better way of doing this, but by using tags, I find that I can generate nice reporting, but also I can filter. So for the stories, I created 5 in particular, and you can create as many stories as you need to break down that epic. Let's take a look at the first one. My first story, if I go and open this, it says run the tool via a single CLI command. Remember, this is for the internal employee, so we do not need a fancy interface. We can run it from the terminal. But let's look at this description. The story usually starts off as a user, but in this case I said as an internal team member. I want to run the tool via a single terminal command with all the secrets in the environment so that I can generate NFT cards effectively without configuring the parameters every time. So from this story, it's clear that we need to create some tool that we can run in the terminal, a CLI tool, and we should be able to configure the environment either beforehand or once so that we don't do it every single time. And to identify when a story has been completed, we have acceptance criteria. So once all the bullet points here for the acceptance criteria have been met, that's usually when we can say we are done with the story, and this should actually be a working piece of functionality at that point. Now, in this case, our acceptance criteria is to set all secrets such as the RPC URL, wallet, private keys, and the ENV, one command to run to trigger the full process, console logs to show the steps, and then if it fails, a tool for showing logs, right, or what went wrong, basically. So when we have implemented all of this, right, and a story is not a task for a user to just go and work on. They can technically, but a story can also be broken down in subtasks to make it easy for developers or different developers to take on these tasks to work together to finish this story. And the acceptance criteria is usually where business rules get defined and should be strictly adhered to. In my case, I made it a bit more technical for me to just outline the things that I need to do and also what I feel like this journey or this story should accomplish. But when the developers are done with either their subtasks or the story itself, they would actually go and push it to testing, and then testers will actually tell them if they've met the criteria or not, based on if it's a technical thing they can check or an actual non-technical process. So if we start with the story, we put it in progress, we work on the subtasks, which we still will get to, and then once it's done, we put it to done. So for now, we will not do that yet, but we will later in the series. So yeah, that's roughly how I define my user stories, and you can define yours in a similar way. You can your own flavor if you need some extra details on it as well. For the rest of the stories, I'm not going to go in detail, but I'll cover some of them. So the second one is to fetch the NFTs and their metadata. So this story talks more about the process itself, what happens when we start running this tool. So as an internal team member, I want the tool to fetch NFTs from a specified wallet and resolve their metadata. So NFTs have metadata where images can be found and such, right? so that I can identify which NFTs to process and get the data needed for the card generation. And here we've got a few acceptance criteria too. For the other stories, it talks about wallet generation, so generating the wallet as a step. And then we also have this one, which is to transfer each NFT to a corresponding wallet. And then finally, to generate printable cards. So now you can see the high level stories that I have in order to complete my tool. One thing about the stories is, although my stories are quite technical because I get to think about what needs to happen in various cases, sometimes user stories are not technical at all. It would just give you the requirements, such as the parameters that someone's name can be in a text field and such. So this does not define how the app is going to be built, just what needs to happen, right, and be built, and what we expect as a user using the software. I expect to just run a simple command. I expect for it to go and fetch the NFTs, generate some wallets for me, and transfer the NFTs automatically. And then I am expected to have printable cards, if I can put it like that. Head back to our project plan and go into the third step. Now, for our third step, this is something usually the architect or a developer can do to help draw out a process flow, right? The process flow usually goes hand in hand with kind of what your stories are all about. You can look at the stories and say, well, if we need to do this, depending on the stories, we can kind of determine how the code will flow, what the process looks like, basically. This does not define what technology you use, nothing like that. And this actually comes before the architecture diagram, which we'll get into as well. It also shows how users or systems interact with the tool, and it helps visualize the build. And then it helps validate that your user stories actually match, right? And also you can catch missing stories that should be there if you find that a process cannot work in such a way, right? So this is what I'm going to show you, what I've drawn up. If we go back to my page and we go to the process flow, I can click here. There's a page for it over there. And now I can actually go and visually see this. So I'm going to click on this. And the tool I use to out is actually called draw.io. So I'm going to go to the software so you can see. And you can use draw.io to draw your diagrams and learn a bit about how these process diagrams are built. And it's very easy, straightforward once you get the gist of it. I am in no ways an expert in drawing diagrams, so please don't judge this harshly. It is just for me to kind of visually make sense of what I need to build. And that's basically what the diagram should achieve, right? We should not focus on technologies, but just the flow of it. What happens when we need to make a decision? Should we go forward? Should we close the flow? Should we go to another process, right? That's what you need to indicate in the process flow. All right. And remember that this should kind of align to our user stories. Now, also another thing to note about process flows is that they can indicate the wider view of a process. So they can be as simple as enter and exit. And also it could show sub processes. So you can go nested into deep processes. But I took kind of the stance of looking at the user journeys and seeing what needs to happen in various steps in order for us to complete one cycle of running this to get the printable cards. So in my process, what I started off with is a start. And in a process flow, you'll have your start and your end point down here. And so we can start by looking at, we run the CLI command, run.ts. We then go and we load all the environment variables. Remember, our user story required us to load the environment variables. We do not want to configure it again. Then we can go and see, are all the environment variables set? Now, this is where the process flow is helpful, right? This is a decision block. So if we have not successfully loaded all the requirements, then we're going to go down this route, which I'll show you. If we have, we're just going to continue down the yes path. Each of these no paths I'm going to show you all ends up going here. It stops with an error and then ends. Okay, we want to stop the execution because we deal with the blockchain and transferring NFTs. So we want to stop it as soon as possible without really causing any harm. Once we have all the NVs, we go down and fetch the token IDs from the wallet. Again, we ask ourselves, do we have the IDs found? If no, we're going to close and exit. If yes, we're going to continue to try and fetch the metadata, as this is what one of our stories spoke about. After finding metadata, we need to validate that we have that for the NFTs. And this is a recurring thing, especially for this tool in particular. Different tools will require different processes. It's not as linear as this, um, but this one is seeing that we have steps that needs to be completed before the next one. So then we go ahead and generate some Ethereum wallet. We go and we check if the wallet was generated successfully. Again, no, yes. If it was, we create an export, render the NFT card as PNG. Once all the cards have rendered, we then only go and transfer the wallets. Now, in the process here in the user stories, we actually say that we need to transfer before we generate the NFTs. But I was thinking for the process to do this before we transfer to generate the cards, because once you transfer, you cannot go and regenerate those wallets, right? They might be lost. So the safer option here is to generate the cards first and later do the transfer. Because if the transfer fails, we can actually go and stop the process and manually transfer the NFTs if needed as a fallback. Lastly, we check if it was successfully transferred. If yes, we can show a success message and end. And this is kind of simple, this process flow, but it really helps to kind of show developers kind of the flow, kind of the checks that needs to be in place. And it can indicate to developers how that process should work. Now, back into our project planning, we've talked about the process flow, which is optional, but is really helpful. Something that is really important for any kind of project and software that you build is to have and design the system architecture. Basically, this is what your system is made of, right? And this is really important to see what technologies are going to be used. This is usually done, right, after you know what you need to build. And this is done by technically drawing out process flows and having user journeys and such. Once you have that, you can plan and start drawing up a system design for this actual product. So we can break down each logical step into technical services, modules, interfaces. This will have dependency layers and actually talk a bit more about the technologies that is involved in building your system. And this is a great way for people to also have a high level understanding, especially from a technical approach, and also see what the system is all about and what technologies you are using. So let's go ahead and take a look at my system design. So it's very familiar to you now that you've seen some diagrams of the process flow. It's kind of similar, right, with boxes and stuff. But essentially, the system design speaks more about what technologies are being used, how the system actually works and interacts from a high level. You can also put a lot of detail in this, down to the point where you define interfaces in some of the designs as well. However, this is a high enough overview for me to understand what is happening in my system. So I've just defined two sections, internal and external. You don't need to do that, but it's for me to clearly indicate when do I go and reach out to data outside of my system. So basically, we've got our entry point here, and we've got a few services. So internally in this system, I have got things like the NFT scanner service and a metadata service. I've got the wallet generator service, and I've got the NFT card generating service, and of course, the NFT transfer service. You'll see each one of these services, some of them connect to others, meaning that data flows towards another service, or some of them require external usages of other services, such as this NFT scanner service. In order for us to scan the NFTs, we need to reach out to the Ethereum RPC, right? Otherwise, we won't know what data the blockchain has. And similarly, Here, for the NFT metadata service, we indicate that we do need to reach out and get data from either IPFS or Arweave. And if we look at the wallet generation services, here I just put users ethers.js as I really specifically want to make sure we use ethers.js. And I also have an extra service called QR code service that the NFT card generator would use to generate the QR code. Maybe I want to swap this out for a different looking QR code, and that's why that is a separate service on its own. Something important to note here is that all of these don't need to be services, especially the ones that don't reach out and get external data. However, I just kept to this convention to make it straightforward and simple and not confuse everyone watching. So basically, once we have generated, I also show that we're going to reach out to our file system into an output folder. And much like how the data kind of flows, I also roughly indicated that lastly we would go and also do the transfer and yet again reach out to the Ethereum RPC to go and execute our transaction code. And yeah, that is basically it. This is just giving us a higher overview of our tool, more data, more insight, and more context around what we are building. And that's kind of the point about planning, right? Is to really give you that context and that confidence to go ahead and actually plan the thing that you are going to execute. So, going back to our project plan, the last step that you actually will do, and this step I had to change up a bit because I noticed it didn't say what it needed to say. But the fifth step here is to really go ahead and now, with all this context, with the fact that we know the epic, with the fact that we know the user stories, what the user is expecting, with a suggested process flow, and with a system design that we can look at and see the technologies we should use, we can go ahead now and break down the user stories into tasks. And this will help us, as this point suggests, translate clearly from what to how. How are we going to implement this? What is needed to successfully complete each one of our stories so that we meet our acceptance criteria? So how this works is for each one of these stories, I've created a few tasks. Remember the story tags. So if I go down to a task section, this is also a database, I can now clearly define what we need to do. You can start off with tasks even before breaking down the story tasks, such as draw the process, draw the system architecture design. So it doesn't have to chronologically follow that fifth step. You can start by defining tasks that you need to get started, right? Even with a plan, you can have as a task. But in the sense of the story breakdowns, here you can see is our first story. I said we need to go and initialize Node.js, a Node.js project with TypeScript support, and then create the entry point for our CLI for generating the NFT cards. Each story can also have its own description and generally have story points, points that we assign that will determine the effort involved. How much time do we spend on completing the story, or should we spend? Or how much effort is involved if we start basing it on time to complete that story? This will give us a good idea to start seeing how much capacity do we have as a developer. Are we a single developer and can only work on weekends? Thus, we can only complete 3 to 4 of these stories, maybe over a weekend, maybe a bit more. Or are we a team? What's our capacity like? Can we take in a certain amount of story points or stories with their tasks and complete that to complete the stories? And this is really where Scrum kicks in and Agile and kind of running sprints. And that's a whole nother thing, right? The point here is that you will have a list at the end of the day to complete what you set out to complete right here in the beginning. If you complete all of those tasks and those stories and understand through the diagrams and the architecture what needs to happen, you can do it very quickly. And in a structured approach, if you need more help, you can ask for assistance, show someone your actual plan, and they can just fall in and start helping out. They would know what technologies are being used, they would know where to start, and They will not have as many questions for you if someone needs to help you out. And of course, like I said, this helps you out as a developer to build cool MVP tools or tools for your business, whatever it might be. So, with that said, the next step for our series, this video series, is for us to actually run over these tasks and go through them, implement them, take them one by one, and complete our user stories. This will happen in a few videos, and I hope that you're going to follow this journey and see how we build out this tool, look at stories, change the stuff a little bit, but all in all, have some fun building a project from start to finish. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, let me know in the comments. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Cheers for now.